In today's business world, being an average CEO is no longer an option. That's why we're committed to equipping you with the resources and the tactics necessary to not just survive, but to thrive. You're listening to Not Your Average CEO Lifeline podcast, where we are more than just a voice in the crowd. Hi, everyone. Not Your Average CEO Lifeline here. I am joined today again by Chuck Mollor. Most of you have heard from him before, so I'll just ask Chuck, can you give our audience who may not be introduced to you already a little bit of your background, just a snippet before we dive in. Today, we are talking about leadership and continuing the conversation on what it takes to be not necessarily just a good leader, but an agile leader, a great leader. Go ahead, Chuck.
Oh, thanks, Nicole. Well, one, thanks for having me back. I'm excited to be back and speaking with you and with your audience. I am a owner and CEO of a company called MCG Partners. We're a leadership, culture, and talent optimization consulting firm, a firm that's been around since 2007, so we've been around quite some time. Before that, I was a CEO of a global consulting firm in this space, and I've been in consulting over 35 years. Actually, I have to be really honest and say over 40 years. So I've been doing this for quite some time. I'm also an executive coach. I started coaching when I started MCG Partners, 18 and a half, almost 19 years ago. And I have written a book called The Rise of the Agile Leader. Can you make this shift? And as you and I just talked about a minute ago, I'm in the early stages of writing my second book, which is called The Optimal Leader: Mastering Your Impact.
Wonderful. So today we're going to try and really focus in on being an agile leader and what that means. So what does that mean in practice today for today's leaders, today's economy, the culture? Can you dive into it a little bit for us, Chuck?
Yeah, it's interesting, because sometimes when you write a book, one of the questions, at least I have, especially leadership books, is how long can it be applicable to what's sort of the practical realities of what we're dealing with right now in business, and as business continues to evolve and change as it has over the last 5 years. The good news is I think my book is as applicable today as it's ever been before. And being agile, and in our book we actually have an agile leader model where we kind of describe those kind of key characteristics, and there's many really key characteristics, but some of them is about, understanding your natural self. How do you personally deal with change, decision making, um, your ability to not only handle that yourself, but also how you show up and drive change and drive decision making, in an organization. What's your capacity to deal with risk? What's your capacity to delegate and empower others? What's your natural leadership style, your natural management style? So when you think about agile, and of course we're talking about the verb here, it's really about how on a day-to-day basis, not just on a strategic basis when there is an initiative or there's a merger and acquisition or there's a shift in the marketplace, but really how do you create a culture and a work environment where people have a sense of ownership. You create an environment where people feel they can challenge the status quo, but you're also have clarified on a consistent basis and a constant basis, what do we value? What's important to us, not only as an organization, as a culture, but also in terms of how we show up and how we do our individual and collective roles, how we work not only individually, but collectively as teams. So agile is really encompassing all those things, especially in a marketplace, as we know, that continues to evolve and change and shift on a constant basis. And the foundation of all this is really around innovation, right? Because if you do not continue to innovate, not just in terms of products and services, but how you approach the market, how you approach your customers, and the overall value you provide, then frankly, you're not going to be in business, 3 years from now. So it is about understanding how to create that environment and how to lead in that environment so that you can be successful as a business on a very practical level.
We were talking a little bit earlier, Chuck, about what's the CEO's mindset now versus years ago. I'm just interested to know what you think may be one of the biggest shifts for leaders from, say, 5, 10 years ago to what's happening now.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think as I mentioned to you just a few minutes ago, I'm actually in the early stages of writing a brief article slash blog that we're going to put out next week. And in a lot of ways, it's a good segue because this will be also captured in a more thorough way in the new book. But I think one of the biggest challenges right now for CEOs and sort of their reality today is the amount of change that's happening within management and on executive teams. Executive team, it's not necessarily new, but it's the intensity of the turnover, the frequency of the turnover, and frankly, one of the things that we don't talk about in business often is how it has such an incredible impact to not only how teams operate and make decisions and deal with conflict and can be strategic and frankly add value, but that sort of ripple effect it has in the organization and your culture. And so the change of leadership, and especially at the CEO level, but frankly also the change on executive teams has a very direct and then ripple effect in an organization culturally. So let me be very specific, and I can give you some very specific examples. Um, I remember and now, as we also know, very often the changes are happening externally. So people have to come into an organization and also figure out, what are the cultural norms? How do I fit in here? Versus just showing up and saying, well, this is how I want to do it, and ignoring those cultural norms, which is a huge problem, in organizations. But the one specific example I'll give, and I'll let you ask me some more questions, is I've worked very specifically with a very, very large company, a global firm where the CEO was retiring and a CEO was being promoted internally from a business unit, and they had multiple business units. And this new CEO literally had the exact opposite leadership style and expectations. So the first CEO was probably a little more hard charging, liked having sort of competition within business units and within the executive team, like creating, you want to call it sort of non-stated friction and competition. People operated more in silos. And it was that it was a very still a very effective team, very successful company, but a very, very different type of an executive. The new CEO was much more focused on collaboration, was much more, his sort of definition, without getting too many details here, his whole definition of how he wanted to communicate, how he wanted to work with not only the team, but individually was very, very, very different. So the executive team struggled to the point where they brought me in to work with the CEO and members of the executive team, and there were 10 of them, to figure out how to get them to operate in a more successful, effective way where they were aligned on those expectations. And the reason I want to illustrate this example, because this happens every day, sometimes not this dramatically, but the moment you have a new executive on an executive team, a new CEO, just inherently they're going to bring different characteristics, different behaviors, a different style. And if they come from an external organization, they're going to bring their own experiences, their own sense of culture, their own sense of how they operate. And that brings such great complexity into an executive team. And as I said earlier, it has a ripple effect because people pause. People don't know where we're going. They don't really understand what success means, not just in terms of the relationship and decisions and communication, but frankly, how to operate as an organization, as a business. So to me, it's one of the biggest challenges in business today.
I would agree. And I would say it also goes the other way around with um, when a new hire comes on board, having clear expectations for what the culture of the company is, because they're going to bring just as much. If they're not in a C-suite, they're going to affect um, things regardless. And I'm always a firm believer of setting great expectations, not only on the job description, the hiring process, onboarding, training, to slowly have new hires adapt to your culture as well. But I want to talk a little bit about uncertainty and disruption and some practical steps that leaders can take and adapt to quickly when that happens without losing sight of the vision. What do they need in their arsenal of resources in order to adjust when organizations start to have uncertainty and shifts?
Yeah, a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges, and I alluded to this a minute ago, is that even if you're a CEO, but any member of an executive team, frankly, anyone that has, management responsibilities, you're often hired with a charter, meaning you're given a charter by the board, by the CEO, by an executive to say, here are all the initiatives, here are all the changes that I want you to be driving, which is why we're hiring you. You bring this expertise, you bring this skill set, or why we're even promoting you. So it can happen internally as well. And the opportunity is not to take on that role and show up that first day, or frankly, the first few months with guns a-blazing, right? It's not the, AK corral where, you're looking for the fight out in the streets. So, what I mean by that is, the most effective approach is learn, is ask, is understand. You need to assimilate to the culture. Even if you're going to be changing that culture, even if you're going to be making changes to the business because there's some business challenges, even if you need to make changes to your team, the best thing you can do is really observe, learn, and assimilate yourself into an organization. Now, if you're a CEO, it's a little different. So there are differences depending on the role and the level and how big the organization and the complexity. So there's no one simple formula for this, but you're still wanting to observe and learn. Again, I can give you plenty of examples of executives I've worked with that have made that mistake of showing up. And I'm talking about, very senior executives in large organizations with sometimes even thousands of employees versus hundreds, where they've made that mistake and they literally have lost any kind of credibility. Now the question is why? And let me be very specific. The why is this. When you're driving change, because everything we're talking about is driving change. Just by showing up in your role, there's immediate instability because you're new. You're an unknown into the organization. And if you're going to be driving change, whether you realize this or not, you're inferring that whatever you've been doing to date is wrong. So to drive change, to rally your new organization around you, whether you've been hired internally or externally, you have to establish trust. You have to establish credibility. It has to be about the we, not about the me and the I. So if you're trying to say, here's what I want to do to you, the inference is what you've been doing is wrong. And people are going to not only resist, people are going to be not engaged, and in worst case scenario, they're going to check out, they're going to move on, they're going to start looking for another job, or they're going to infer you're not the right person for the job. So this has happened time and time again. It still happens today. So you need to really, it's obviously a little different if you're a CEO, but even as a CEO, you need to learn, you need to build relationships, you need to evaluate, you need to understand, because even if you've been given a charter by whoever hired you still need to assess on your own what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, where are we, where are the gaps in terms of what we need to do, but where we are today and where we need to get to, because you can't do it alone. You still need to be able to have the right people around you. Now, if you do have a talent issue, if you have talent gaps, then yes, after that 60, 90-day period, or however long it may need to be, but at least 60, 90 days, then start making the changes you need to make. But again, you got to do that with your people, not to them. And that's a really, really key mindset shift and an approach in terms of how you work as an executive.
You've given our audience a lot to think about, but I think the one um, umbrella of all the pieces of advice you've given thus far really relates back to someone being self-aware. Um, can you talk a little bit about self-awareness and what tools or practices our audience can use to build their self-awareness so then put everything that you have just said into practice, right? Because you have to know and be self-aware before you can, in my opinion, think about even think about change or thinking about how you have to be agile, you have to be aware of yourself, in my opinion.
No, agreed. And I will answer that. I think it's a combination of both. Yes, you have to be self-aware, and I'm going to give you two very specific ways of doing that. But what we're even talking about also are specific strategies of how to approach and drive change and how to become a member of an executive team, how to frankly manage your new organization, and how to show up when even if you're having changes on your team, and how to assimilate them as part of your leadership team. So it's a combination of all those things. So the self-awareness piece is really critical. And for some of these executives and leaders, they're probably participating or observing or listening to our podcast. They've probably, some of them may be smiling and nodding their head and say, "Yep, I've been there. I've learned from my mistakes. I know what Chuck's talking about because it's happened to me." Um, and hopefully, sometimes, unfortunately, our failures or mistakes are our best ways of how we grow and how we learn and how we evolve. I know I've been there, by the way. That what we're talking about is very applicable to me in my career as well, and some of the mistakes I have. But from a self-awareness standpoint, I think what's really important is taking advantage of the tools that are out there. One tool would be a behavioral assessment. They're not all created equal. There's very few that are what I call valid instruments, which actually is a scientific term describing how accurate the tool is, meaning they pass this threshold of accuracy. So I'm a big believer of working with valid instruments versus instruments that have not passed that threshold, where you can use them for both development and hiring. And hiring meaning,
Curious on your instruments. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah.
because I'm a big proponent of using them, but I'm curious as to what your
Yeah, so
recommendations are.
we've been when I started the firm, we looked at a number of behavioral assessments because we use them often in our practice in our company. We use a tool called the Predictive Index, or PI. It's
Yeah.
been around since 1955. There's hundreds and hundreds of research studies to evaluate and demonstrate how accurate it is. So it's actually one of the most accurate behavioral assessments in the world. The reason we're really big fans of PI because it's very easy to take. It's a 7-minute assessment. It's only 2.5, 3 pages versus 40, 50 pages of data that some other assessments are, which frankly, no one has the time or the interest to dive that deep into the analytics. And most importantly, it really translates very, very nicely into what your natural leadership and management style is, and your sense of decision making, how you deal with conflict, how you deal with risk, how you deal with change. And now, at the end of the day, any behavioral assessment should help you understand not only how do you show up and how do you handle pressure and stress, what happens to you under pressure and stress, but also it's not just always about ourselves. One of the things we don't often talk about when we talk about behavioral assessments is, yes, we have to understand ourselves better and how we impact others, but do we understand the people around us well enough? Do we understand them and what motivates and drives them? So it's not just about behavior and personality. It's really understanding what motivates and drives you and how you show up in your role and how you approach your job and what you kind of gravitate towards, but also how you work with people. So, how you influence. Are you a person that's really more about being assertive and dominant and just telling, sharing your opinions versus are you effective in how you facilitate dialogue and ask questions and understand how other people think? Are you focused on details and process and operations? Or are you a person that, hey, that's for somebody else, including, rules are meant to be broken or rules are meant to be followed. So I can go through a litany of specific behavioral, very practical, realistic scenarios that impact how not only us individually, but as teams operate. And so understanding that about yourself and understanding about the people around you is really, really critical. So that's one of the most important and critical self-awareness tools. And if you're not been exposed to that, and again, the key word is valid instrument, and I would recommend Predictive Index or PI. And if anyone wants to reach out to me and talk about PI, I'm happy to do that. The other piece is getting feedback from others, and there's really two approaches to doing that. You can do that through something that's been around for quite some time called a 360 assessment, where a person is able to, or a group of people are able to take an online survey to help describe you in terms of your leadership and management capability. And it's a pretty thorough set of questions with ratings, and then you self-assess. So you get to compare how you see yourself or how others see you. And it's really meant to be, again, a self-awareness, but also a development tool. It's meant to identify, yes, these are your strengths, but these are also how people feel there's an opportunity for you to be more effective. Um, that has mixed results because as an organization, you have to be educating people about what the purpose and intent behind a 360 is. Some organizations misuse a 360 because sometimes people are concerned that someone's going to know what I said and is it confidential and how is this information going to be used? Is there any repercussions on giving constructive feedback or negative feedback when it comes to that manager or that leader? So again, the key there is as an organization, you need to make sure you're educating your people, you're creating an environment that is very positive about the intent and purpose behind a 360. But as an individual leader, from the best practices, and there's research that supports this, Nicole, which is as a leader, you should be able to go to your key people, and I'm talking about not just your direct reports, but your peers and other key people in the organization to say, hey, here's the one thing I'm working on as a leader right now to be more effective. Can you give me some feedback? So your ability to go to people to say, one, I value your opinion. It means something to me. Two, I actually recognize I have something I need to work on as a leader. I'm not infallible. Yeah, I'm still in my learning journey, no matter what my level is. And I know I need some feedback because I have blind spots. I can't see everything. You're sending such powerful messages to your people when you do occasionally go to them to say, hey, I'm giving you permission to give me feedback, but more importantly, I value your opinion and I realize I need development. I'm still on my journey to learn and develop and get better. So you're sending some very, very powerful messages. Now, not everyone is going to always respond. Some people are more comfortable than others. And if you've never done it before, it's going to take some time for people to adjust to your new approach of asking for feedback. But your ability to ask for feedback, and I know and have worked with some very, very successful leaders that are seen as incredibly successful and talented leaders, and they still do this. And their organizations and their people really appreciate the fact they do that, and they actually set a tone. They're saying, hey, as an organization, as a leadership culture, you know, our ability to recognize we have at least one, two, three things that we're working on as individual and collective leaders, and we need feedback to get better. You're setting a very positive tone of not only inclusion, but that not only people matter in terms of their opinions, but we all have some things we need to get better at. So those are the two, to me, the most important strategies from a self-awareness and from a self-development standpoint.
Thanks, Chuck. You've given our audience, I think, a lot to digest as it comes to being a better leader, an agile leader, and someone who can really dive into an organization and take it to its next level when it comes to leadership and setting an example. My last question, which you have been asked many times before, so I don't want you to dive too much into it, but if you can give me a sentence or two on maybe what has changed, or if you feel the phrase "not your average CEO" has remained the same for you over the last several years.
I just think the most important decision any CEO, any executive can ever make in their life is that investment in themselves from a development standpoint. You know, the biggest mistake, and it's happened, I've seen it, I've worked with executives that they get there, is when they're still trying to prove to everybody around them how successful they are and how smart they are and how capable they are. Now, we all know there's some insecurity that comes with that. There's some self-doubt that comes with that. There's the whole imposter syndrome of do I really belong? But once you can get comfortable in your own skin and realize, yes, maybe I don't have all the skills, I don't have all the training, maybe this is a stretch for me, especially if you just got promoted. Maybe you do have some self-doubt and insecurity. We all do. But if you can get comfortable in your own skin and say that the best executives, the best leaders in the world, the best companies in the world, they are still open to learning. They're open to development. When you feel you're at the pinnacle of your career, the pinnacle of your success, I have it all, I know it all. That's when you're in the most dangerous position to fail. Because when you've lost that sense of humility, that sense of I'm still on my learning journey, that's when you're in a weak state. So I think that that's the biggest advice I would give to anyone is continue your journey, always be open, always be curious, continue to set a tone that you want people to challenge you, you want people to be honest with you, right? I think the biggest concern over the years, including myself as a CEO, and the CEOs I've worked with and spoken to that I know, is are my people being honest and open with me? Are they being direct with me? I don't want them just to tell me what I want to hear. I want them to challenge me, to question me, and to tell me the way it is, including bad news and challenges. That's the advice I would give to anyone listening to this.
Thank you, Chuck. As always, can you just tell our audience where they can find more from you? And I will include it in the show notes.
Yeah, sure. Best way to reach me is probably an email. It's chuck.mollor, Mollor, at mcgpartners.com. I'm also easily findable on LinkedIn at Chuck Mollor. Yeah, those are the best ways to reach me.
Thank you, Chuck. You've been listening to Not Your Average CEO Lifeline with your hosts Danielle Cuomo, CEO, and Nicole Glitchio Els, COO. This podcast has been sponsored by Virtual Assist USA. If you'd like to know more about the hosts or exploring virtual assistant services, visit virtualassistusa.com for more information.